The name's on the bottom. The canteen arrived on a Tuesday. It came in a government issue box made of pine, 14 inches wide, sealed with 2 bands of brown paper tape and stamped in red ink on every outer face. War Department, Personal Effects, Ohio, District 7. The postmaster carried it himself to the Hollis farm on Canaan Ridge Road, 4 miles outside Barnesville, because it was too large for the mail pouch, and because he had carried enough of these boxes in the past 2 years to know they were never left at a door without a witness. He set it on the kitchen table. He removed his hat. He did not stay. Margaret Hollis was 31 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and hadn't cried since the notification letter arrived in April of 1865, 16 months earlier. She had a farm to run, 22 acres of winter wheat, and a half-broken mule named Cotton, and 3 children under the age of 8 who needed to see their mother functioning. She had cried exactly once on the night the letter came, out in the barn with her face pressed against Cotton's neck for approximately 30 minutes. Then she had come inside, banked the fire, and started calculating how much wood she would need to split before the first frost. She opened the box with a kitchen knife. Inside, packed in wood shavings, were 4 items. A folded wool cap, size medium, with a brown stain along the left brim that she did not examine closely. A small leather Bible with his name written inside the cover in his own hand. Elias J. Hollis, 88th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, Company D. A brass button from a uniform coat, its eagle design worn almost smooth from handling, and a canteen. She lifted the canteen last. It was standard Army issue, Model 1858, consisting of a pressed tin body covered in sky blue wool, a cork stopper on a short chain, and a shoulder strap, missing its middle buckle. Thousands of men had carried this exact canteen. Every Union soldier who saw active service between 1862 and 1865 was likely issued one at some point. There was nothing unusual about it, and she set it down on the table next to the Bible. Then she turned it over. Scratched into the unpainted tin of the base, in letters so small she had to carry the canteen to the window to read them, were 17 names. She read them 3 times. The scratching was careful. Whoever had made it had used a nail or the tip of a bayonet, working slowly, with the deliberate pressure of someone who wanted the marks to survive. The letters were uneven in size but consistent in direction, readable left to right, in 2 columns of 8 names, and 1 at the bottom alone, set apart from the others. Each name was followed by a number. A few of the numbers contained a dash and a second figure. She did not yet know what the numbers meant. None of the 17 names was Elias Hollis. She read them a 4th time. She was still standing at the window. Outside in the field, her oldest boy Thomas, age 7, was trying to lead Cotton toward the water trough, and the mule was refusing, as he always refused, pulling his head left and sideways in the way mules pull when they have already decided they are done for the day. The ordinary afternoon continued. She looked back at the canteen. The names were Caleb Morrow, Arch Denton, James Price, Silas Lowe, Henry Cutter, Frank Dent, Moses Cutter, William Redd, Bird Harmon, Aaron Camp, George Sims, Jesse Fenn, Luke Coles, Thomas Vine, Robert Breed, Oliver Sass, Aaron Sims. She copied them down on the back of a flour sack using a nub of pencil she kept on the windowsill. Then she went outside to help Thomas with the mule. The 88th Ohio Volunteer Infantry had been organized at Camp Dennison, Ohio, in the summer of 1862. It consisted of approximately 930 men at the time of its first muster, drawn primarily from Guernsey, Noble, and Morgan counties. Rural men, farmers, and tradesmen, a few school teachers, a blacksmith or two. Elias Hollis had enlisted on August 9th, 1862, at the age of 26, listed in the enrollment record as an occupation of farm laborer and given the rank of private. He had been promoted to corporal in the winter of 1863 and to sergeant, supply sergeant, by the following spring. The regiment had seen action at Vicksburg, at Chattanooga, and during the Atlanta campaign under Sherman. It had marched, it had dug, it had buried its dead and carried its wounded and eaten what it could find and drunk from rivers that should not have been used for drinking. By the time Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April of 1865, the 88th Ohio had lost 89 men killed in action, 214 to disease, and 47 to wounds sustained in combat. Another 23 were listed as missing. Elias Hollis was among the missing. The War Department's notification letter, dated April 29, 1865, stated that Sergeant Elias J. Hollis of Company D, 88th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, had been reported absent without record, following operations in the vicinity of Savannah, Georgia, in December of 1864. The phrase absent without record was not a classification Margaret recognized from the pension forms she had already begun to study. It was not killed in action. It was not missing in action. It was not deserted, which would have been a different letter from a different office. It was something else, a category that did not appear in the War Department's published classification guide for soldier status, a copy of which Margaret had requested and received in July of 1865, 38 pages long, printed in small type on thin paper. She had read all 38 pages. Absent without record appeared nowhere in them. She had written 3 letters to the War Department in Washington between May of 1865 and February of 1866. The first asked for clarification of her husband's status. The second asked for the name of the commanding officer who had filed the absence report. The third asked for a copy of any after-action record pertaining to Company D's movements in December of 1864. The replies she received, 2 form letters and 1 handwritten note on War Department letterhead, answered none of these questions. The form letters expressed condolence and directed her to the Bureau of Pensions. The handwritten note, signed by a clerk whose name she could not fully read, stated that the records of the 88th Ohio Volunteer Infantry for the period of November through December 1864 were currently under administrative review and could not be released to private parties at this time. That letter was dated September 12th, 1865. By October of 1866, the records were still under review. She had also visited the Barnesville Veterans Post twice in the spring of 1866, where she spoke with 2 men who had served in the 88th Ohio. A farmer named Dowd who had lost 3 fingers at Missionary Ridge, and a younger man named Everett who walked with a cane and did not like to be asked questions about the campaign in Georgia. Dowd told her that supply sergeants often ended up separated from their companies during the chaos at the end of Sherman's march, and that absent without record meant the Army had simply lost the paperwork, which happened more than people wanted to admit. Everett told her that he hadn't known Elias Hollis personally and could not help her. She went home both times feeling like a door had been politely closed in her face. The canteen changed everything. She did not begin with the names. She began with the numbers. Each name on the canteen's base was followed by a figure. Caleb Morrow, 14. Arch Denton, 9. James Price, 22. And so on. 3 of the entries had dashes with a second number. Moses Cutter, 17-3. Bird Harmon True, 11-2. Robert Breed, 8-1. She stared at these for an evening before concluding that the single numbers might refer to ages or distances or dates, and the double figures might indicate something else entirely, a unit designation perhaps, or a sequence. She could not determine which. What she could do was begin looking for the names themselves. She started with the county death records. The Guernsey County Courthouse held death registrations going back to the 1840s, and she drove the wagon into town on a Friday morning in late October and spent 4 hours at a clerk's table going through the ledger volumes for 1863, 1864, and 1865. She was looking for any of the 17 names. She found none. Not one of the 17 appeared in the Guernsey County Death Register for any of those 3 years. She tried Noble County the following week, riding 8 miles each way in cold that was starting to settle into something serious. She found no matches. She wrote to the Bureau of Colored Troops in Washington. She had noticed, sometime during her 3rd reading of the names on the canteen's base, what she had already half suspected from their first reading, that several of these men shared surnames common among freed black men in the Ohio Valley and the border states. Morrow, Price, Cutter, Red, names that often denoted men who had taken the surname of a former enslaver or chosen one from a county map, or simply taken the name of a man they had worked for. She was not certain of this. She knew nothing certain yet. But she wrote to the Bureau of Colored Troops on November 4th, 1866, stating only that she was attempting to locate the service records of 17 men whose names were in her possession and whose status was unclear to her. The Bureau of Colored Troops replied 17 days later with a single typewritten paragraph stating that the names she had listed did not appear in the Bureau's enrolled service records, and that no unit designation could be assigned to individuals not on the rolls. Not on the rolls. All 17 of them. She spent 3 evenings that November at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, working by lamplight with a county map spread open across the flour sack copy of the names. She was trying to find the numbers. If the single-digit figures weren't ages and weren't distances, they might be something geographic. Mile markers, road designations, property grid numbers from a survey. She traced routes across the Georgia campaign map she had obtained from a newspaper supplement published in June of 1865. Sherman's march had moved through Georgia in 2 columns, the right wing and the left wing, cutting a swath 60 miles wide between them, from Atlanta south to Savannah over a period of 24 days in November and December of 1864. She located 14 possible road numbers that matched the figures on the canteen. Then she found something else. Tucked into the inner pocket of the leather Bible, behind the back cover, between the end paper and the board, was a folded slip of paper she had missed entirely on her first examination of the canteen box's contents. It was approximately 3 inches by 4 inches, torn unevenly along one edge, and written on in a hand she recognized immediately as her husband's. Small, pressed hard, the letters leaning slightly right. He had written it in pencil, and the pencil had dulled during the writing, so that the last lines were fainter than the first. It read, December 8th, 64, Ogeechee Crossing. Sent forward with the detail. No officer name given. No regimental designation. Told to move at 0400 and hold the left flank until the pickets advanced. They did not come back. I could not follow. I counted 17 going out. I could not follow. Below this, in letters smaller still, almost too faint to read. If anyone finds this, the names are on the bottom. She sat with that slip of paper for a long time. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare branches of the walnut tree at the edge of the yard, and cotton shifted in the barn, and the fire in the stove settled into the deep, quiet ticking that it made at that hour of the night. The lamp threw a steady circle of yellow light across the table. She read the note again. Then she read it again. I counted 17 going out. Her husband had been there. He had seen them leave at 4 in the morning before dawn, sent forward across a river crossing in Georgia in the early days of December 1864, without an officer's name recorded, without a regimental designation, without any paperwork that would have followed them into the ledger that the Army kept for every soldier who fought and every soldier who died under a recognized flag. And he had scratched their names into the bottom of his canteen because he understood, even then in the dark before dawn at the Ogeechee River, that no one else was going to record them. He knew they were going to be erased. He knew it before they crossed. She did not sleep that night. By morning, she had made 3 decisions. The first was that she was going to find out who gave the order. The second was that she was going to find out whether any of the 17 had survived. The third was that she was going to find out why someone had gone to the trouble of removing every trace of 17 men from the records of the United States Army, and how long they had planned to keep it that way. She was 31 years old. She had a farm, a mule, and 3 children. She had $22 in ready money, a wagon that needed a new left wheel hub, and a pending pension claim that the Bureau had not yet resolved. She had a Bible with a slip of paper in it and a canteen with 17 names scratched into its base. She had been a farmer's wife and a farmer's widow. Now she was something else. She drove into Barnesville on the morning of November 23rd, 1866, with the canteen wrapped in an oilcloth under the wagon seat, and the slip of paper folded into the inside pocket of her winter coat. Her first stop was the newspaper office of the Barnesville Enterprise, where she asked to speak with the editor, a man named Coburn, who published the paper twice weekly and was known to have served as a correspondent during the Vicksburg campaign. She asked him whether he had ever heard of an engagement at the Ogeechee River crossing in December of 1864. He had not. She asked whether he knew anyone who'd been with Sherman's right wing during the final march to Savannah. He gave her 3 names. 2 of them were dead. The third was a man named James Yount, who had been a quartermaster's clerk with the 14th Corps and was currently living in McConnellsville, Morgan County, approximately 40 miles east of Barnesville. She wrote the name down. Then she drove home, fed the children supper, split wood until her arms ached, and began composing a letter to James Yunt. She wrote 4 drafts before she found the right words. Words that would not frighten him, would not reveal too much, and would not give him anything he could use to tell someone else she was asking. The final version was 7 sentences long. It mentioned the 88th Ohio, the Ogeechee crossing, and the date of December 8th, 1864. It did not mention the canteen. It did not mention the names. It asked only one question. Were you present? She sealed the letter and set it beside the lamp. In the barn, Cotton was already quiet. The children had not woken. The fire had gone low enough that she could see the orange line of the coals through the stove grate. She sat for another hour at the kitchen table in the cold, with the canteen in front of her, and read the 17 names one more time. Aaron Sims was last. He had been written alone at the bottom, separated from the others by a 1/4 inch of bare tin. She had noticed this on her first reading, but had not thought carefully about it until now. Every other name had been scratched at roughly equal intervals, packed into 2 columns, with a consistent spacing between entries. Aaron Sims had space around him. He had been added after the others, or he had been placed apart deliberately. She ran her thumb across his name. The scratches were the same depth as the rest, the same pressure, the same nail or blade, or whatever instrument Elias had used in the dark before dawn on December 8th, 1864, before sending 17 men across a river with no officer's name attached to the order. But Aaron Sims was alone at the bottom. She stared at that for a long time. Then she banked the coals very carefully, so they would last until morning. The man who was never there. James Yunt did not reply for 11 days. When his letter arrived, on December 4th, 1866, a date Margaret noted because it was exactly 2 years and 4 days after the engagement she had asked about, it was 3 sentences long. The handwriting was cramped and pressed hard into the paper, the kind of pressure a man uses when his hand is doing something his mind is arguing against. It read, Mrs. Hollis, I was present in the capacity you describe. I would prefer not to put anything further in writing. If you are willing to come to McConnellsville, I will speak with you once. Once. He had underlined it. She arranged for Thomas to stay with the Dowd family down the road, left her youngest 2 with a neighbor woman named Ida Ferris, who took in children for 50 cents a day, packed a single bag, and drove the wagon 40 miles to McConnellsville in weather that was already suggesting January had come early. The roads through Morgan County were frozen into ruts that caught the wheel hub every 1/4 mile. Cotton hated the cold and expressed this opinion with his ears and his pace. The trip took 2 days. She arrived at dusk on December 9th, 1866, and found Yunt's house on the east side of town. A small, well-kept frame house with a woodpile that was taller than its owner, and a dog that announced her from 50 yards out. Yunt came to the door before she knocked. He was 43 years old, thin-faced with close-cropped gray at his temples despite his relative youth, and the kind of permanent squint around the eyes that men develop from spending years reading small figures in bad light. He had been a quartermaster's clerk. The work showed in his posture, the slight stoop of a man accustomed to leaning over a desk, and in his hands, which were restless even when he was standing still. He offered her coffee, which she accepted. and they sat at his kitchen table while his wife moved silently in another room. And Yount said nothing for approximately 4 minutes, staring at the surface of his coffee. Then he said, "How did you find out about December 8th?" She set the canteen on the table. He looked at it for a long time. He did not touch it. His jaw tightened and then released, and he looked up at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for 2 years and has just been shown that someone else can see the weight. "Your husband," he said, not a question. "He was there," she said. Yount nodded very slowly and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup without drinking from it. "I know he was there," he said. "He shouldn't have been. He was supply. He wasn't assigned to the detail. He happened to be at the crossing that morning. Wrong place." "Or right place," Margaret said. Yount looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he said, "Turn the canteen over." She did. He read the names without touching the tin, his lips moving very slightly through the 2 columns. "All of them," he said. "All 17, she said. He got up and went to the window and stood there with his back to her for a long moment. When he turned around, his face had made a decision. "I'm going to tell you what I can tell you," he said. "And then I'm going to ask you to be very careful about what you do with it." What James Yount told her took approximately 1 hour and required 2 cups of coffee and a period of silence in the middle that lasted nearly 4 minutes. In November of 1864, Sherman's army was in the final phase of the March to the Sea. 60,000 men moving in 2 columns through Georgia, living off the land, cutting the Confederate supply network, and racing toward the coast. The right wing, which included the 14th Corps and associated quartermaster elements, had reached the Ogeechee River by early December. The river was not wide, 40 feet in most places, 60 in the winter flood season, but its southern bank was held by Confederate pickets, and the crossing would need to be cleared before the infantry could move in force. Standard procedure called for a cavalry probe, followed by an infantry screening element, followed by the main crossing. Standard procedure took time. Someone at the level of brigade or division had decided that time was not available on the morning of December 8th and had ordered a forward detail to cross on foot at 0400 before the cavalry moved to clear the southern bank for the main advance. The detail was 17 men. They were not cavalry. They were not infantry from the line regiments. They were, as Yount described them, with the flat, careful language of a man choosing words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. Laborers attached to the forward supply element, a classification that existed bureaucratically, somewhere between soldier and civilian, assigned to carry, dig, haul, and perform tasks the Army needed done without wanting to account for them in the regimental roles. They were black men, every one of them. This was not, in itself, unusual by December of 1864. The Union Army had been using black laborers in informal capacities since the first months of the war, and the Bureau of Colored Troops, established in 1863, had formally organized dozens of regiments of black soldiers who had fought at Port Hudson, at the Crater, at Fort Wagner. Over 179,000 black men served in the Union Army before the war's end. That was not the extraordinary fact. The extraordinary fact was that these 17 men were not enrolled. They had not been mustered in. They had no unit designation. They had no service records. They were not on any regimental roll, any supply manifest, any quartermaster's labor account. They had been brought forward. Yount's word was collected, spoken quietly, from the direction he was still not looking at, from the free black settlements along the route of march 3 weeks earlier, assigned to the forward supply element by a verbal order, and had been living and working alongside the Army column for 22 days, without a single entry in any official document. "Who gave the order to send them across?" Margaret asked. Yount was quiet for a long time. "The order was verbal," he said. "It was relayed through the supply element's ranking officer. I was present when it was relayed. I was not told the originating name. But you know it." He looked at her. "I know what I heard. I don't know what I can prove. Tell me anyway." "No," he said, and then, after a pause, "Not yet." She stayed in McConnellsville for 2 nights, sleeping in a boarding house on Front Street that cost 30 cents per night and smelled permanently of coal smoke and boiled wool. She used the time to visit the Morgan County Courthouse, which held records for veterans' pension applications filed in the county since 1865. She was looking for any of the 17 names. She searched the index volumes for pension claims, 1865, 1866, and found nothing. She requested access to the county's copy of the state death registry for the same period. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers and a cooperative disposition, brought her 3 ledger volumes and left her at a side table for 2 hours. In the 1865 death register, under the entry for June 11th, she found the name Aaron Sims, colored, age approximately 35. Cause exposure. Location unincorporated Morgan County. The entry was brief and imprecise. No next of kin. No prior address. Occupation listed as laborer. Her throat tightened. She copied the entry exactly onto a fresh piece of paper. Then she looked at the canteen again in her memory, at the name written alone at the bottom of the 2 columns, separated from the others by a clear 1/4 inch of bare tin. Aaron Sims. Written apart. Written last. Written in a space that Elias had deliberately left. He had known. He had known when he scratched the names into the tin on the morning of December 8th, 1864, that Aaron Sims was different from the other 16. He had placed him separately for a reason. She did not yet know the reason, but she knew that Aaron Sims had died in Morgan County, Ohio, 6 months after the war ended, listed only as laborer and colored and age approximately 35, which meant he had survived the crossing, which meant at least one of the 17 had come back. And if one had come back, perhaps others had. She returned on the 2nd evening to Yount's house. She did not knock immediately. She stood for a moment at the gate in the cold, watching the light in his front window, thinking about the sequence of things she now knew. The 17 men were not enrolled. They were sent across a river at 400 to clear a bank held by Confederate pickets. Her husband saw them go. He scratched their names into a canteen. He was listed as absent without record. And the official records of the 88th Ohio Volunteer Infantry for November and December 1864 had been under administrative review, unavailable to private parties, for 14 months. She knocked. Yount opened the door immediately, as though he had been watching for her. He stepped aside to let her in and said nothing until she was seated at the table again. Then he said, "I've been thinking about what else I can tell you." "Aaron Sims made it back," she said. Pause. "I know," Yount said. "He made it back. 3 others did. She set down her pencil very slowly. 3 others. Of 17. 13 did not return from the South Bank, Yount said. His voice was flat and even, in the way voices go flat when they have been rehearsing something for a long time. 3 came back wounded, one of them badly. Aaron Sims came back last, at approximately 700 after the cavalry had already moved up and the main crossing had begun. By that time, the detail was no longer a recognized operational element. What does that mean? It means, Yount said carefully, that by the time the infantry crossed in force and the battle reports were being compiled, there was no officer willing to sign a document that acknowledged those men had been sent forward on a combat order. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Because if they acknowledged the order, Margaret said slowly, they would have to acknowledge the men, and if they acknowledged the men, they would have to account for the 13 who didn't come back, Yount said. And accounting for them would mean listing them as killed in action. And listing them as killed in action meant they had to be enrolled. And enrolling them, even retroactively, even posthumously, meant their families, if they had families, could petition for a death benefit. He looked at her steadily. Someone decided, he said, that 13 death benefits was too complicated a thing to explain. Margaret Hollis left McConnellsville the following morning before first light, with the canteen under the wagon seat and 5 pages of her own notes folded into the pocket of her coat. The temperature had dropped overnight to something close to 12 degrees, and the road back toward Barnesville was white and silent under a sky the color of pewter. Cotton moved without argument for once, perhaps because the cold encouraged efficiency. She drove for 3 hours before stopping at a wayside inn in rural Monroe County to rest the mule and drink something hot. She sat at a corner table and read her notes. Yount had given her 4 things before she left. He had given her the rough count. 17 sent out, 4 returned, 13 unaccounted for in any official record. He had given her a time, 400 on December 8th, 1864, at the Ogeechee River crossing near the point where the old Augusta Road crossed the southern bank. He had given her the name of the supply element's ranking officer who relayed the verbal order, a man named Lieutenant Wallace Creed, 14th Corps, who had resigned his commission in March 1865 and returned to civilian life in Cincinnati. And he had given her one final piece of information, offered at the door as she was leaving, in a voice so low that she almost did not catch it, over Cotton's impatient stamping on the frozen ground. The administrative review on the 88th Ohio's records, Yount said. The one the War Department told you is ongoing. It was closed in August. She stopped. What? It was closed in August of 1866, he said. I know because a man I served with works in the records division. He told me the review was closed and the records were sealed, not returned to open access. Sealed. Who authorized the sealing? Yount looked at her for a moment with the look of a man standing at the edge of something and calculating the drop. That, he said, is the question I would be very careful about asking out loud. She was careful. For the next 3 weeks, she said nothing to anyone. Not to Ida Ferris, not to the Dowds down the road, not to the postmaster who asked how she was getting on. She worked the farm, split wood, fed the children, banked the fire each night, and thought. She was building a map in her head. What she had was a canteen, a slip of paper in her husband's handwriting, 6 hours of conversation with a frightened quartermaster's clerk, and a death registry entry for 1 man out of 17. What she needed was Lieutenant Wallace Creed of Cincinnati. She had no money for a second-long journey. The wagon trip to McConnellsville had cost her 4 days and $1.60 in road expenses. Cincinnati was twice that distance and would require more preparation, a better plan, and a reason for Creed to speak to her at all. Because unlike Yount, Creed had been the one who actually relayed the order. Yount was a witness. Creed was a participant. Those were different things, and men who had participated in something they were not proud of did not typically open their doors to widows asking inconvenient questions. She needed leverage. In January of 1867, she wrote a second letter to the War Department Records Division. This time she did not ask for the 88th Ohio's records. She asked specifically for the service record of Lieutenant Wallace Creed, 14th Corps, formerly of Cincinnati, Ohio. She cited the Army Regulations Act of 1866, which she had found referenced in the pension guidance document, and which she understood to grant veterans and their surviving families the right to request service documentation for purposes of pension applications. The Records Division replied in 9 days. The letter was a single paragraph. It stated that the service record of Lieutenant Wallace Creed, 14th Corps, was unavailable for release, as it was associated with records currently under Special Administrative Designation. Special Administrative Designation, not under review, not sealed. Associated with records under Special Administrative Designation, a phrase she had not seen before in any of the 38 pages of the War Department's classification guide. In any of the 6 letters she had received from various federal offices over the past 2 years. She wrote the phrase down and underlined it 3 times. Then she wrote a third letter, not to the War Department and not to anyone in the Army. She wrote to a man named Ezra Fellows, who had been a reporter for the Cincinnati Commercial during the war years and who had published in the winter of 1865 a 12-part series on the Bureau of Colored Troops Records Management. She had found a reference to his work in a newspaper supplement she had kept from 1865, folded at the bottom of a hat box. She did not know if Fellows was still at the paper. She did not know if he would respond. She did not know if he had any knowledge of the Ogeechee crossing or of any of the 17 names on the canteen's base. She sent the letter anyway. In February of 1867, she received a response. It was not from Fellows. The letter had a Cincinnati postmark, but was written on plain paper with no letterhead. The handwriting was not Fellows. She had no sample to compare it to, but the letter opened by stating that Fellows had passed her inquiry to a colleague who may have more relevant knowledge of the matter in question. The colleague did not provide his name. He provided instead a single piece of information that stopped Margaret cold at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in February, while the children ate breakfast behind her, and the fire in the stove popped and shifted in the way it did when the temperature outside was below 20. The nameless colleague wrote that he had in his possession a copy of a document that appeared to be a handwritten operational order dated December 7th, 1864, the day before the Ogeechee crossing, directing a forward labor detail of not fewer than 15 men to advance across the river in advance of the cavalry screen and clear the South Bank picket line by force if necessary. The document bore no unit designation. It bore no signatory line. But in the upper right corner, where Army operational orders typically recorded the originating command, there was a stamp, a regimental stamp, not the 14th Corps, not the supply element, not any unit associated with Lieutenant Wallace Creed. The stamp read, Office of the Provost Marshal General, Special Operations Division. She read it twice. Then she sat very still. The Provost Marshal General was not a field commander. He was not a regimental officer. He was not a man who issued orders to labor details at river crossings. The Provost Marshal General was the senior law enforcement officer of the Union Army, the man responsible for military discipline, prisoner management, counterintelligence, and the suppression of desertion. He had no operational reason to issue that order, unless what happened at the Ogeechee crossing on December 8, 1864, was not a tactical decision, unless it was something else entirely. The nameless colleague's letter ended with 2 sentences. The first said, I will not correspond further on this matter by the Postal Service. The second said, if you intend to pursue this, you should know that a file was opened in the Provost Marshal's office in April 1865, bearing the reference notation ORI-7, and that this file, according to a man who saw it and is no longer in federal employ, contained the names of 4 individuals described as witnesses to the events of December 8th. One of the 4 names was Elias Hollis. The fire in the stove had gone low without her noticing. The children had finished breakfast and gone outside, and the kitchen was cold in the specific still way it gets, and the wood has burned down to coals, and no one has added another log. The letter was in her hands. She read the last 2 sentences again. A file was opened in the Provost Marshal's office. One of the 4 names was Elias Hollis. He hadn't been lost in the chaos of the march. He had not wandered. He had not deserted. He had not drowned at a river crossing or fallen from disease or been caught by a Confederate picket in the wrong moment of the wrong morning. He had been listed as a witness by the Provost Marshal General of the United States Army in a file opened in April 1865, just days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, just days after there was no longer a war to provide cover for what had happened on the south bank of the Ogeechee River at 400 on December 8, 1864. She stood up and put another log on the fire. Her hands were steady. She did not know yet what had happened to the 3 other witnesses. She did not know what had happened to her husband after he was listed in that file. She did not know who had ordered the sealing of the Army records, or who had written the stamp on the operational order, or what the reference notation ORI-7 meant in the filing system of the Provost Marshal General's office. But she knew one thing that she hadn't known that morning. Elias Hollis had not disappeared by accident, and whoever had filed that notation in April of 1865 knew exactly where he was. What the Ogeechee kept she found? Wallace Creed in the spring. It took 3 attempts to reach him. The first letter she sent to his last known address in Cincinnati, obtained from a city directory at the Barnesville post office, was returned unopened in March of 1867, marked addressee relocated. The second letter, sent to a business address she found through an Ohio Veterans Enrollment Ledger at the county courthouse, produced no reply for 6 weeks. The third she sent through Ezra Fellows at the Cincinnati Commercial, asking only that Fellows confirm whether Creed was alive and willing to receive a visitor. Fellows replied in 9 days. Creed was alive, living in the Price Hill neighborhood of Cincinnati, working as a bookkeeper at a dry goods firm. He was not, Fellows wrote carefully, a well man. She arranged the children again, borrowed $2 from the Dowd family, and drove the wagon to the railway station at Caldwell in the second week of April 1867. The train to Cincinnati cost $1.40 and took 6 hours. She arrived at the Price Hill address on a Thursday afternoon, in weather that was finally beginning to remember it was spring, and knocked on the door of a narrow 2-story house set back from the street by a small yard with no garden. Creed answered the door himself. He was 51 years old and looked 70. He was thin in the way serious illness makes a man thin, not the leanness of hard work, but the hollowing of something persistent and interior. His skin had a yellowish cast. He breathed carefully, as though he had learned not to waste breath on anything unnecessary. He looked at her for a moment, then at the carpetbag in her hand, then back at her face. "You're the Hollis widow," he said. "Yes." "I wondered," he said, "how long it would take." He had been wondering for 2 years. He told her so within the first 10 minutes, seated in his front parlor with the windows open to the April air and a glass of water on the table beside him that he did not touch. He had known since April of 1865 that someone was eventually going to arrive at his door. He hadn't known it would be a woman from Guernsey County with a carpenter's steadiness and a canteen in her bag. He had expected, if anyone came, that it would be a man from the Provost Marshal's office, arriving not to ask questions, but to deliver a reminder. No one from the Provost Marshal's office had ever come. He did not know whether that meant he was safe or forgotten. He suspected forgotten. He was not a significant man. He had been a lieutenant, a clerk, a conduit for orders he had no power to question. He had relayed the order to send the 17 men across the Ogeechee. He had done so at 0340 on the morning of December 8th, 1864, in the cold dark at the river's edge, reading from a written instruction that was handed to him by a courier he had never seen before and never saw again. The instruction had been on a half sheet of paper bearing the Provost Marshal's office stamp. He had read it aloud to the detail's informal leader, the large, quiet man named Caleb Morrow, and then the men had moved down to the water and crossed. "What was on the south bank?" Margaret asked. Creed looked at his hands. Confederate pickets, 8 or 9 of them from what the cavalry found afterward. A screen position, nothing fortified. 8 or 9 men, she said, against 17. Against 17 men with 3 rifles between them, Creed said quietly. The detail didn't carry arms. They were labor. They'd carried picks and shovels for 3 weeks. That morning they were given 3 rifles and told to cross. The parlor was very quiet. "They were meant to die," Margaret said. Creed did not answer for a long moment. Then he said, "I believe they were meant to clear the picket line and take casualties doing it. Whether they were meant to take the kind of casualties they took, I cannot tell you that with certainty." He paused. "What I can tell you is that the order was given before the cavalry assessment was complete. We did not know precisely what was on the south bank. The men who wrote that order may have known. I did not." "Who wrote the order?" Creed picked up his water glass, set it down without drinking. "A man named Colonel Radford Pell," he said. "Special Operations Division, Provost Marshal General's office. He is currently a senior clerk at the Interior Department in Washington. He has been there since September of 1865. Margaret wrote the name down. What Creed told her over the next 2 hours was not a confession. It was something more complicated than a confession. A thing built from partial knowledge and long guilt. And the particular caution of a man who understood exactly what he could prove and what he could not. In the autumn of 1864, there had been a significant theft within Sherman's supply network. 41 wagons of forage, corn, and feed grain had gone missing between Atlanta and the march's forward position. Their contents diverted through a scheme involving falsified manifests, substituted load weights, and a network of civilian contractors who moved the grain south and sold it to Confederate commissary agents for Confederate currency, immediately convertible to gold. The theft was estimated by the internal inquiry that followed it at a value of approximately $12,000. The men who orchestrated it were not Confederate agents. They were Union officers. 3 of them held the rank of captain or above. The internal inquiry was conducted by Colonel Radford Pell's division of the Provost Marshal's office. By November of 1864, the inquiry had identified the 3 officers and had begun assembling documentation for court-martial proceedings. The documentation was solid. The case was nearly complete. Then someone realized there were witnesses. Not soldier witnesses, not officer witnesses. Men who could be transferred, promoted, silenced with a posting. The witnesses were the laborers who had been loading, unloading, and moving those 41 wagons for 6 weeks of the march. Men whose labor had made the supply network function and who had, by necessity of their work, seen exactly what went into each wagon and what came out. They could not be promoted. They could not be transferred. They were not enrolled in the Army, and so no official process existed for managing them. There were 17 of them. Pell saw the problem, Creed said. The officers under investigation had legal counsel. Counsel had already indicated they would call witnesses for the defense, anyone who could testify to the loading procedure. The laborers would have been compelled to testify, and their testimony would have been corroborating. The defense lawyers would have used it to argue procedural irregularity in the manifests, which would have helped the officers. It would have complicated the prosecution, Creed said. Pell didn't want the prosecution complicated. He wanted convictions. The war was almost over. He wanted to close it cleanly. Creed paused for a long moment. I believe he thought if the 17 were no longer available to testify, the case would proceed on documentary evidence alone. Cleaner, faster, less visible. Margaret set her pencil down. He sent them across the river, she said, so they couldn't testify. Creed said nothing. And my husband, she said, he saw the order, he was there. He was listed as a witness in the Provost Marshal's file. There were 4 witnesses to the order being read and the men crossing, Creed said. Your husband was one, I was one. A cavalry scout named Berthold was one. And the 4th was Aaron Sims. Aaron Sims survived the crossing. He did, Creed said. He was the last one back. He came back at 0700 with a knife wound to his left arm and a story that nobody was prepared to write down. He lived. He made his way north after the armistice. He died in Morgan County in June of 1865. The death registry listed him as exposure. Yes. Was it exposure? Creed looked out the window at the small yard and the street beyond it. He was quiet for 11 seconds. She counted. I don't know, he said finally. I genuinely do not know. I know that a man from the Provost Marshal's office was sent to Morgan County in the spring of 1865. I was told this afterward. I don't know what his instructions were. The 3 other witnesses had fared differently. The cavalry scout, Berthold, had been reassigned to a remote posting in New Mexico Territory in July of 1865 and had died there of typhoid fever in the winter of 1866. The death was documented and unremarkable. Creed himself had resigned his commission in March of 1865 before the armistice, citing a medical condition, which was genuine, though it had not been urgent enough to compel resignation before he understood what he had relayed that morning at the river. His resignation had apparently satisfied the Provost Marshal's office that he was no longer a functional threat. He had heard nothing from them since. Elias Hollis was listed as absent without record in April of 1865. "What does that mean?" Margaret asked. "Where is he?" Creed looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Something careful and very still. The expression of a man about to give someone something they cannot put down once they have picked it up. "I don't know where he is now," Creed said. "I know where he was in July of 1865. There was a federal detention facility. Not a prison exactly. An administrative holding location in the lower Shenandoah Valley, used during the final months of the war for individuals whose status was complicated. Personnel who had seen things the Army was still deciding how to categorize. He was held there. He was listed there," Creed said. "Whether he remained, I can't tell you. I was told this by the same man who told me about the Morgan County posting. He is no longer in federal employ, as your correspondent noted." "What is his name?" "Thomas Weld," Creed said, "formerly of Cincinnati. He left the city in the winter of 1866. I don't know where he went." She returned to Barnesville in the 3rd week of April 1867. She had 5 names now: Radford Pell, Wallace Creed, Berthold, Thomas Weld, and the name of a detention facility she had asked Creed to write down for her on a piece of paper, which he had done after a long pause, in his careful bookkeeper's hand. Camp Reston, Frederick County, Virginia. She had a partial truth, a partial map, and a partial account of what had been done and why. What she did not have was her husband. She wrote to Camp Reston, Frederick County, Virginia, in May of 1867. The letter was returned in 3 weeks, stamped facility closed, forwarding address not available. She wrote to the Army post at Winchester, Virginia, which she identified from the rear of a veterans directory as the nearest permanent installation to Frederick County. They replied that they had no record of a facility called Camp Reston, and no record of a soldier named Elias Hollis having been processed through their district. She wrote to the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, the Freedmen's Bureau, whose Virginia district office was in Richmond, asking whether any of the 17 names from the canteen appeared in their records of displaced laborers or contraband camp residents for the period 1864 to 1866. The Bureau replied that their records for that period were incomplete and that the names she provided did not appear in the indexed portion of their files, though they acknowledged the indexed portion represented perhaps 40% of the total documentation. 3 letters. 3 dead ends. In the summer, she tried a different direction entirely. She had kept, from the beginning, the one surviving piece of physical evidence beyond the canteen itself: her husband's note, the slip of paper from the Bible. She had read it so many times that she had memorized it without trying to, the way you memorize things you cannot stop returning to. December 8th, 64, Ogeechee Crossing. Sent forward with the detail. She had always focused on the content. Now she focused on the paper. It was thin, approximately 3 inches by 4 inches, torn unevenly along its left edge. It was not from a personal notebook. The grain and weight were wrong for that. It was the correct weight for a form, an army form. Specifically, she held it to the window in full morning light and looked at the very edge of the torn side. She could see the ghost of a printed line, and below it the faint, partial curve of a letter, and below that, the remnant of a column rule in the specific blue tint used by War Department printing offices. It was torn from a supply manifest. Not just any manifest. A supply manifest would be numbered, dated, unit designated. If she could identify which manifest series used this exact paper stock and this exact column rule color, she could narrow the date and the unit. And if she could narrow the unit, she could cross-reference it against the 14th Corps' logistics chain during the Ogeechee crossing, and potentially identify which supply element Elias had been attached to on the morning of December 8th, and who his immediate commanding officer was that day. She did not know how to do this herself, but she knew who might. She wrote to Ezra Fellows at the Cincinnati Commercial for the second time. Fellows came to Barnesville himself. He arrived in September of 1867 on the afternoon train, a compact, rapid-moving man of 45, with a reporter's instinct for sitting quietly in a room until the room told him something. He spent 4 hours at Margaret's kitchen table, examined the canteen, examined the slip of paper, read her notes, and said very little. He ate the supper she offered and then sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. "You understand," he said, "that Radford Pell is currently a sitting federal official?" "Yes." "And that what you have, a dead man's testimony on a scrap of paper, a frightened ex-officer's verbal account, and a canteen, is not sufficient for a criminal charge?" "I know." "But it may be sufficient," Fellows said slowly, "for a story." He published it on November 14th, 1867 in the Cincinnati Commercial. It ran across 3 columns of the front page under the headline, 17 men. No names, no records, no graves. The Ogeechee crossing and the question no general has answered. The article named no names. Not Pell, not Creed, not the 3 officers whose theft had precipitated the whole sequence of events. Fellows was careful. He presented the documentary evidence, the canteen, the slip of paper, the death registry entry for Aaron Sims, the War Department's acknowledgement that the 88th Ohio records were sealed, and he asked a single simple question in the final paragraph, which Margaret had read in his draft the night before and suggested he sharpen. Were these men citizens, soldiers, or property? Because the United States Army appears to have treated them as none of the above. The response was immediate and significant. 4 other newspapers reprinted the story within 2 weeks. The Boston papers, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chicago Tribune. 2 congressmen from Ohio requested an inquiry. The War Department issued a statement acknowledging that the records of certain units and associated labor elements from the Georgia campaign were under ongoing administrative review, repeating, almost word for word, the language they had used in their letter to Margaret 14 months earlier. which fellows printed alongside the statement with no comment. Radford Pell resigned from the Interior Department on December 3, 1867. He gave no public reason. He left Washington and retired to his family's property in rural Maryland. He never made a public statement about the Ogeechee crossing. He died in 1889 at the age of 71. His obituary in the Baltimore Sun described him as a dedicated public servant with 30 years of government experience. The 3 officers involved in the forage theft, whose names emerged through the congressional inquiry in the winter of 1868, were never court-martialed. 2 had left the Army by 1865. 1 had died of a stroke in 1866. The case against them was considered closed by the inquiry on the grounds that the passage of time and the deaths of key witnesses made prosecution impractical. The 4 survivors of the Ogeechee crossing, 3 of them still unidentified, were never formally found. What the congressional inquiry did produce in March of 1868 was a partial unsealing of the 88th Ohio Volunteer Infantry records for November and December 1864. The unsealed documents included a supply sergeant's daily log, pages 44 through 61, covering November 28th through December 9th, 1864. The log was in Elias Hollis's handwriting. It had been filed and sealed in April of 1865 along with the rest of the unit's records. Margaret received a copy through the congressman's office in April 1868. 26 pages, closely written, detailing requisitions and distributions and inventory checks, and the ordinary granular work of keeping an infantry regiment supplied through 3 weeks of hard marching. The final entry for December 8th was 4 lines long. 0330. 17 men departed with forward detail. Ogeechee South Bank approach. No officer designation received. No manifest filed. No orders in writing. I have recorded their names. Below this, in smaller writing, I do not believe they will come back. And below that, a single final line. Someone should know they were here. The log was the only official document in existence that acknowledged the 17 men at all. The inquiry closed in June of 1868 without issuing charges. The Provost Marshal General's files, including the reference file ORI-7 that had listed Elias Hollis as a witness, were resealed under a classification order and did not become publicly accessible for another 41 years, when a junior archivist at the National Archives discovered them during a routine cataloging project in 1909 and flagged the anomaly to her supervisor. Elias Hollis was never found. Margaret Hollis filed for a widow's pension in May of 1868. Citing the congressional inquiry's acknowledgement of the sealed records as evidence that her husband's disappearance was connected to federal action. The Bureau of Pensions denied the claim in September of 1868 on the grounds that no death certificate existed and no remains had been identified. She appealed in 1869. The appeal was denied in 1871. She filed a third claim in 1873, citing the further unsealing of additional 14th Corps documents produced by a separate inquiry. That claim remained unresolved for 7 years. She received her pension in 1880, 15 years after the war ended. It was $14 per month. She was 45 years old. Her oldest son, Thomas, had taken over the management of the farm. Cotton the mule had died in 1872, at an age the veterinarian estimated at somewhere between 22 128 years, which he said was extraordinary. She planted a winter rye crop that fall and split her own wood as she had always done. And in the evenings she sometimes sat at the kitchen table where the canteen had first been opened 14 years earlier, and she thought about numbers. 13 men who did not come back from the south bank of the Ogeechee River. 17 names scratched into a tin base. 41 stolen wagons. $12,000. 1 slip of paper. 3 letters returned unopened. 1 article in a Cincinnati newspaper. 41 years of sealed files. 1 archivist in 1909 who noticed something wrong. And 1 canteen. The canteen was donated to the Guernsey County Historical Society in 1921 by Margaret's daughter, Clara Hollis Parr, who was 63 years old at the time of the donation, and who attached to it a handwritten card that read, "Carried by Sergeant Elias J. Hollis, 88th Ohio Volunteer Infantry." The names on the bottom are the names of 17 men who were sent across the Ogeechee River, Georgia, on the 8th of December, 1864, and who were never recorded by the United States government as having existed. My mother wrote their names in a ledger she kept until her death. She asked that the ledger be kept with the canteen. The ledger was kept with the canteen. The Guernsey County Historical Society held both items for 83 years, cataloged under Civil War miscellany, Hollis family. In 2004, a graduate student researching labor history of the Georgia campaign came across the entry in the Society's index and requested to examine the objects. She spent 2 days with them. She published a 30-page paper the following year. The paper was titled simply, "The Ogeechee 17." It identified through cross-referencing the 17 names against Freedmen's Bureau labor registries, contraband camp records, and post-war census entries, the probable origins of 11 of the 17 men. 8 had come from farms in central Georgia. 2 had come from a contraband settlement near Marietta. 1, Caleb Morrow, listed first, described by Creed as the detail's informal leader, had been born free in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1831, and had been working as a teamster for the Union Army since July of 1863. He had walked into the Army's orbit a free man from the same city where Wallace Creed had spent 20 years trying to forget what he had seen. The 13 men who did not return were never buried with markers. No record of their remains exists. No pension was ever paid. No government document in the 160 years since the morning of December 8th, 1864, has acknowledged their names or their deaths in an official capacity. The canteen is still in Guernsey County. The names are still on the bottom